In the depths of a Russian winter, when snow blankets the vast expanse from Moscow to Siberia, there's something almost magical about the silence that falls over this enormous land. Tonight, as you settle into the comfort of your bed, let me take you on a journey through one of history's most dramatic and transformative stories. A tale of empire and revolution, of peasants and czars, of blood and hope that would reshape not just Russia, but the entire world. The Russian Revolution wasn't just a single event. It was a cascade of moments, decisions, and desperate acts that unfolded over decades, building to an explosive climax that would echo through the 20th century and beyond. This is the story of how the largest empire on earth crumbled from within, how centuries of autocratic rule gave way to chaos, and how from that chaos emerged something entirely new. Picture, if you will, the Russia of the late 19th century. A land so vast it stretched across 11 time zones, from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean. An empire that encompassed not just Russians, but Poles, Ukrainians, Georgians, Armenians, Jews, Muslims, and dozens of other peoples. At the center of this colossal realm sat the Tsar, believed by millions to be God's chosen ruler on earth, wielding absolute power over more than 100 million souls. But beneath the glittering surface of imperial palaces and orthodox ceremonies, something was stirring. In the factories of St. Petersburg, workers labored 16 hours a day for wages that barely kept their families alive. In the endless fields of the countryside, peasants still bound by ancient obligations dreamed of owning the land they tilled. In the universities of Moscow and Kiev, young intellectuals gathered in secret societies, whispering dangerous ideas about freedom, equality, and revolution. The story begins not with gunshots or manifestos, but with the slow, grinding pressure of a system that could no longer contain the forces building within it. For centuries, Russia had been ruled by the Romanov dynasty, czars who claimed their authority came directly from God himself. But by the dawn of the 20th century, that divine right was being questioned by growing numbers of Russians who had begun to imagine a different kind of future. Our tale opens in the final decades of the 19th century, when Tsar Alexander III ruled with an iron fist, determined to preserve autocracy against the winds of change sweeping across Europe. Alexander believed that Russia's strength lay in its traditional values: orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. He crushed dissent with brutal efficiency, exiled thousands to Siberia, and tried to turn back the clock on the modest reforms his father had introduced. But Alexander III could not stop the inexorable march of progress. Railways began to crisscross the empire, connecting distant regions and bringing new ideas along with goods and passengers. Factories sprouted in major cities, drawing peasants from their villages into a harsh new world of industrial labor. Universities expanded, creating a growing class of educated Russians who read forbidden books and debated radical philosophies. The seeds of revolution were being planted in the most unlikely places. In the smoky meeting halls where workers gathered after their shifts, listening to speakers who promised them dignity and fair wages. In the countryside, where traveling agitators told peasants they deserved to own the land their ancestors had worked for generations. In the drawing rooms of liberal nobles who believed Russia needed a constitution and an elected parliament. But perhaps most importantly, the seeds were being planted in the hearts and minds of ordinary Russians who were beginning to question why they should accept suffering and poverty as their fate. Why should a peasant's children starve while the nobility lived in magnificent palaces? Why should a factory worker die young from dangerous conditions while the owner grew rich from his labor? Why should an entire people submit to the will of one man, no matter how divinely appointed he claimed to be? The first major tremor came in 1881, when revolutionary terrorists assassinated Tsar Alexander II, the reformer who had freed the serfs but couldn't satisfy the growing hunger for change. His son, Alexander III, responded with fierce repression, but the very brutality of his reaction only convinced more Russians that the system was fundamentally unjust. In the universities, students formed underground circles where they studied the works of Karl Marx and other revolutionary theorists. These young men and women, mostly from privileged backgrounds, were willing to sacrifice everything for their ideals. They printed illegal newspapers, smuggled banned books, and gradually built networks that would eventually challenge the entire Tsarist system. Among these student revolutionaries was a young man whose name would become synonymous with revolution itself. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, who would later take the pseudonym Lenin, lost his older brother to the executioner's rope for plotting against the Tsar. This personal tragedy shaped his revolutionary consciousness and set him on a path that would ultimately lead to the Winter Palace itself. But Lenin was just one voice among many in those early days. The revolutionary movement was fractured into competing groups with different visions of Russia's future. Some believed in terrorism and assassination as the path to change. Others advocated for gradual reform through legal means. Still others called for a massive peasant uprising that would sweep away the old order entirely. Meanwhile, in the vast countryside where most Russians lived, a different kind of revolution was slowly taking shape. The emancipation of the serfs in 1861 had freed millions of peasants from bondage, but it had not given them the land they desperately wanted. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a complex system of communal ownership and debt that often left them worse off than before. Rural Russia was a powder keg waiting for a spark. Peasants saw their former masters still living in luxury while they struggled to feed their families. They watched as their young men were conscripted into the Tsar's army for years of brutal service. They endured periodic famines that killed thousands while grain was exported to pay for the empire's debts. The Industrial Revolution, which had transformed Western Europe over the course of the 19th century, came late to Russia but with tremendous force. In just a few decades, the empire went from being predominantly agricultural to having some of the largest factories in the world. The Putulov works in St. Petersburg employed over 12,000 workers. The textile mills of Moscow drew thousands of peasant women from their villages. But this rapid industrialization came at an enormous human cost. Workers lived in overcrowded barracks, labored in dangerous conditions, and had no legal right to organize or strike. Industrial accidents were common, wages were kept artificially low, and any attempt to protest was met with police violence. The new industrial working class that emerged from this harsh system would become the backbone of the revolutionary movement. These workers had one foot in the peasant world they came from, and another in the modern world of machines and factories. They were literate enough to read revolutionary literature, but poor enough to understand the need for radical change. As the 19th century drew to a close, Russia was a society under tremendous strain. The old order was cracking, but what would replace it remained unclear. Some hoped for gradual reform that would transform the empire into a constitutional monarchy like those emerging in Western Europe. Others believed that only violent revolution could sweep away centuries of oppression and create a truly just society. The Tsar and his advisors, isolated in their palaces and convinced of their divine right to rule, seemed almost oblivious to the forces gathering against them. They continued to believe that the Russian people loved their little father, as they called the Tsar, and that any unrest was the work of foreign agitators and troublemakers. But in the factories and villages, in the universities and meeting halls, a different Russia was awakening. Workers were beginning to organize themselves into unions, despite the legal risks. Peasants were forming their own councils to discuss land redistribution. Intellectuals were writing manifestos that imagined a Russia without czars, without nobles, without the ancient hierarchies that had defined the empire for centuries. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would shake the world. In the first years of the 20th century, all these accumulated pressures would finally reach a breaking point. The revolution, when it came, would not be a single event, but a series of explosions that would ultimately destroy not just the Romanov dynasty, but the entire social order that had sustained it. But before we reach that climactic moment, we must understand the world that created it. The Russia of the late 19th century was a land of extraordinary contrasts. Magnificent palaces rose above slums where families lived in single rooms. Orthodox churches with golden domes cast shadows over factories where children worked alongside their parents. The Trans-Siberian Railway, an engineering marvel that connected Moscow to the Pacific, carried both the promise of modernization and the instruments of repression to distant corners of the empire. This was a society balanced on the edge of a knife, where centuries of tradition met the irresistible force of modern ideas. The collision between these two worlds would produce one of history's most dramatic and consequential revolutions, a story of human ambition and suffering, of idealism and terror, of dreams fulfilled and dreams shattered. As you drift toward sleep tonight, let your mind wander through the snowy streets of old St. Petersburg, where horse-drawn carriages carried nobles to glittering balls while workers trudged home through the darkness to their cramped quarters. Listen to the sound of church bells echoing across the vast Russian landscape, calling the faithful to prayer while underground, in hidden meeting rooms, revolutionaries planned the overthrow of everything those bells represented. The story of the Russian Revolution is about to unfold, and it will take us from the palaces of the czars to the trenches of World War I, from the chaos of revolutionary uprisings to the birth of the world's first communist state. It's a story that changed everything, not just for Russia, but for the entire world that came after. The winter of 1894 brought more than just snow to the Russian Empire. It brought a new czar, one whose reign would witness the final act of the Romanov dynasty. When Alexander III died suddenly of kidney disease, his son Nicholas ascended to the throne at just 26 years old, unprepared for the immense responsibilities that awaited him. Nicholas II was not the man his father had been. Where Alexander III had ruled with confidence and iron determination, Nicholas was hesitant, prone to changing his mind, and deeply uncomfortable with confrontation. He had been trained as a military officer, not as a ruler of the world's largest empire. His diary entries from those early days reveal a young man overwhelmed by the weight of his inheritance, longing for the simple life of a country gentleman, rather than the complex demands of absolute monarchy. But perhaps most fatally, Nicholas shared his father's unshakable belief in the divine nature of czarist rule. He genuinely believed that God had chosen him to rule Russia, and that any limitation on his power would be a betrayal of his sacred duty. This conviction would prove to be his downfall, blinding him to the necessity of reform until it was far too late. The new czar's personal life seemed to promise happiness, at least. He was deeply in love with his wife, Alexandra, a German princess who had converted to Russian Orthodoxy for their marriage. Their love letters reveal a tender, devoted relationship that provided Nicholas with emotional refuge from the pressures of rule. But Alexandra herself would become a source of controversy and ultimately contribute to the dynasty's destruction. The Tsarina, as she became known, was viewed with suspicion by many Russians. Her German origins made her an object of xenophobia, especially as tensions with Germany grew in the early 20th century. More damaging still was her obsession with mysticism and her desperate search for miracle cures for her son Alexei, who suffered from hemophilia, a disease that could kill him with any serious injury. This tragic family secret would have profound political consequences. The constant fear for their son's life drove the royal couple to seek help from various holy men and mystics, eventually leading them to place their trust in Grigory Rasputin, a peasant from Siberia who seemed able to help the young heir during his medical crises. Rasputin's influence over the royal family would become a national scandal that further undermined the monarchy's credibility. But in those early years of Nicholas's reign, such disasters still lay in the future. The immediate challenge facing the new Tsar was how to govern an empire that was changing faster than its institutions could adapt. The Industrial Revolution that had begun under his father was accelerating, creating new social classes and new forms of political consciousness that the autocratic system was ill-equipped to handle. In the factories of St. Petersburg and Moscow, a new generation of workers was emerging. Unlike the peasants who had been brought to the cities by economic necessity, these workers were beginning to see themselves as a distinct class with their own interests and rights. They read newspapers, attended evening schools, and increasingly questioned why they should accept poverty and exploitation as their natural lot. The government's response to growing labor unrest was typically heavy-handed. Strikes were illegal, unions were banned, and workers who protested were arrested or exiled. But repression only drove the movement underground, where it began to take on a more radical character. Secret workers' circles studied Marxist texts that promised them a future where they would control the means of production and share in the wealth they created. Meanwhile, in the countryside, the peasant question remained unresolved. The emancipation of the serfs in 1861 had been a half-measure that freed the peasants from personal bondage, but left them economically dependent and politically powerless. They were required to make redemption payments for the land they received, payments that often exceeded what they could afford. Many peasants found themselves deeper in debt than they had been as serfs. The rural commune system, which the government maintained as a way of controlling the peasantry, prevented individual peasants from leaving their villages without permission and made agricultural innovation difficult. Young peasants dreamed of owning their own land, free and clear, but the system seemed designed to keep them trapped in collective poverty. In the universities, a new generation of intellectuals was grappling with questions that went to the heart of Russian identity. What did it mean to be Russian in an age of rapid modernization? Should Russia follow the Western path of parliamentary democracy and capitalism, or did it have its own unique destiny? How could the empire's many nationalities be integrated into a modern state while preserving their distinct cultures? These debates were not merely academic. They were shaping the political movements that would soon challenge Tsarist rule. Liberal nobles and professional men formed organizations that called for a constitution and civil liberties. Socialist intellectuals organized workers and peasants around demands for economic justice. Nationalist movements in Poland, Finland, and other border regions began to assert their rights to self-determination. The government's response to these challenges was confused and contradictory. Some officials recognized the need for reform and pushed for gradual liberalization. Others argued that any concession would be seen as weakness and would only encourage further demands. Nicholas himself wavered between these positions, sometimes approving reforms and then retreating when faced with conservative opposition. This indecision would prove costly. By refusing to make timely concessions that might have channeled popular discontent into legal reform movements, the regime ensured that opposition would take increasingly radical forms. When change finally came, it would come not through gradual evolution, but through violent revolution. The first major test of Nicholas's reign came with Russia's disastrous war against Japan in 1904-1905. The conflict began almost by accident, as competing imperial ambitions in Manchuria and Korea led to a series of diplomatic miscalculations. Russian officials, influenced by racist assumptions about Asian military capabilities, expected an easy victory against what they saw as an inferior enemy. Instead, the war became a humiliating disaster that exposed the fundamental weaknesses of the Tsarist system. The Russian Navy was destroyed at the Battle of Tsushima. The army suffered defeat after defeat, and the war's enormous cost strained the empire's finances to the breaking point. More damaging still was the impact on Russian morale and the regime's prestige. For the first time in centuries, the Russian Empire had been defeated by a non-European power. The myth of Russian military invincibility was shattered, and with it went much of the awe that had sustained Tsarist rule. If the Tsar could not protect the empire from foreign enemies, many Russians began to ask, what was the point of absolute monarchy? The war's unpopularity also provided revolutionary groups with their first real opportunity to reach a mass audience. Anti-war demonstrations brought together workers, students, and liberal professionals in unprecedented numbers. The slogan, "Down with the war," became a rallying cry that united diverse opposition groups around a common cause. As military defeats mounted and economic hardship deepened, the revolutionary underground that had been building for decades finally found its moment. The careful theoretical work of Marxist intellectuals, the patient organizing of labor activists, and the growing desperation of ordinary Russians combined to create a truly explosive situation. The spark that ignited this powder keg came on a cold January morning in 1905, when a peaceful procession of workers led by a priest named Father Gapon marched to the Winter Palace to petition the Tsar for relief from their suffering. They carried icons and portraits of Nicholas, singing hymns and expressing their faith in their little father's desire to help his people. What happened next would shatter that faith forever and set in motion the chain of events that would ultimately destroy the Romanov dynasty. The story of Bloody Sunday, as it came to be known, marks the true beginning of the Russian Revolution, the moment when the accumulated grievances of decades finally erupted into open revolt against the autocratic system that had ruled Russia for 3 centuries. But before we witness that terrible day and its consequences, let us take a moment to understand the world that was about to be swept away. The Russia of 1905 was still, in many ways, the Russia of the Middle Ages, a land where peasants crossed themselves when they saw their first automobile, and where ancient superstitions coexisted with modern factories. It was a world where time seemed to move at different speeds in different places. In the glittering ballrooms of St. Petersburg, nobles waltzed to the music of European composers while discussing the latest fashions from Paris. Yet just a few miles away, in the workers' quarters of the Vyborg district, families huddled around wood stoves in rooms that had barely changed since the days of Peter the Great. The contrast was so stark, it seemed almost impossible that these different worlds could exist within the same empire. In the countryside, peasants still used wooden plows that their great-grandfathers would have recognized, while in the cities, electric lights were beginning to illuminate the main streets. Telegraph wires carried messages across the vast expanse of the empire in hours, yet in remote villages, news might take weeks to arrive, if it arrived at all. This was an empire caught between past and future, tradition and modernity, faith and reason. The Orthodox Church still held enormous sway over the daily lives of millions of Russians, who crossed themselves at the sound of church bells and believed that their czar ruled by divine appointment. Yet in the same cities where ancient cathedrals dominated the skyline, Printing presses were producing revolutionary literature that questioned everything the church taught about submission to authority. The educated classes found themselves living in a particularly strange limbo. They read Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, discussed philosophy and science, and were fully aware of the democratic movements spreading across Western Europe. Yet they remained subjects of an absolute monarch who could exile them to Siberia without trial, who could censor their newspapers, and who claimed the right to dictate not just their political beliefs, but their religious faith as well. For the growing number of Russians who had traveled to Europe or who read foreign newspapers, the contrast was almost unbearable. They had seen what constitutional government could accomplish, had witnessed the prosperity and progress that seemed to follow in the wake of political freedom. They returned to Russia with burning questions about why their homeland remained trapped in autocratic darkness, while other nations moved toward the light of democracy. The students who gathered in underground circles were particularly affected by these comparisons. Bright young men and women who should have been the future leaders of their country found themselves branded as criminals simply for discussing ideas that were freely debated in London or Paris. They saw their potential being wasted, their talents suppressed, their dreams crushed by a system that seemed designed to prevent progress rather than encourage it. Among these frustrated intellectuals were some who would become household names in the annals of revolution. Vladimir Lenin, still known then by his birth name of Ulyanov, was completing his law studies while secretly organizing workers' circles and writing revolutionary pamphlets. Leon Trotsky, barely out of his teens, was already making a name for himself as a brilliant orator and organizer. These young revolutionaries shared a burning conviction that the Tsarist system was not just unjust, but fundamentally illegitimate. But revolution was not yet inevitable. There were many in Russia who still believed that reform was possible, that the empire could modernize without destroying its basic institutions. Liberal nobles formed organizations like the Union of Liberation, which called for a constitutional monarchy along British lines. Professional men, lawyers, doctors, and teachers organized congresses that demanded civil liberties and an elected parliament. Even within the government, there were voices calling for change. Count Sergei Witte, the brilliant finance minister who had overseen Russia's industrial expansion, understood better than most that political reform was necessary for continued economic progress. He argued that the empire needed constitutional government, not because it was morally right, but because it was practically necessary for competing with other great powers. But these moderate voices were consistently overruled by the Tsar and his conservative advisors, who saw any limitation on autocratic power as the first step toward revolution. They pointed to the example of France, where constitutional monarchy had eventually given way to regicide and terror. Better to maintain absolute rule, they argued, than to risk the chaos that seemed to follow political liberalization. This refusal to compromise would prove to be the monarchy's fatal error. By blocking all avenues for peaceful change, the regime ensured that when change finally came, it would come through violence rather than negotiation. The moderate reformers who might have served as a bridge between the old order and the new found themselves pushed aside by more radical elements who had no interest in preserving any part of the existing system. The workers in Russia's growing industrial centers were particularly receptive to radical messages. Unlike their counterparts in Western Europe, who had won the right to organize unions and had seen gradual improvements in their working conditions, Russian workers faced the full force of autocratic repression whenever they tried to improve their lot. Strikes were illegal, organizers were arrested, and any attempt at collective action was met with police violence. This repression created a vicious cycle that pushed the labor movement in an increasingly revolutionary direction. Workers who might have been satisfied with higher wages and shorter hours found themselves listening to speakers who promised them ownership of the factories where they labored. The very brutality of the government's response to modest demands convinced many workers that the entire system had to be overthrown. The peasants, who made up the vast majority of Russia's population, were slower to embrace revolutionary ideas, but their grievances were no less real. The land hunger that had driven rural unrest for decades was growing more acute as the population increased and available land became scarcer. Young peasants who had served in the army returned to their villages with new ideas about their rights and new impatience with traditional forms of subordination. The village commune, which the government maintained as a form of social control, was beginning to break down under these pressures. Younger peasants chafed at the authority of village elders, while more prosperous farmers resented having to subsidize their poorer neighbors. The old bonds of mutual obligation that had held rural society together for centuries were weakening just as new forms of political consciousness were emerging. All of these social tensions were exacerbated by Russia's economic difficulties in the early years of the 20th century. The industrial boom of the 1890s had given way to recession and unemployment. The war with Japan was draining the treasury and disrupting normal trade patterns. Inflation was eroding the living standards of workers and the growing middle class, while peasants struggled with poor harvests and the burden of redemption payments. It was into this volatile situation that Father Georgy Gapon stepped in January 1905. Gapon was an unusual figure, a priest who had been working with the government to create legal workers' organizations that would channel labor discontent into harmless activities. His assembly of Russian factory and mill workers was supposed to provide workers with social benefits and religious instruction while keeping them away from revolutionary politics. But Gapon was more than just a government agent. He genuinely cared about the workers' welfare and was shocked by the conditions he witnessed in St. Petersburg's factories. When a strike broke out at the massive Putilov works in December 1904, Gapon found himself drawn into the workers' struggle despite his official role as a moderating influence. The strike began over the dismissal of 4 workers who belonged to Gapon's organization, but it quickly spread to other grievances about wages, working conditions, and treatment by management. As the strike expanded to include workers from other factories, Gapon realized that this was his opportunity to demonstrate that legal reform was possible, that the workers' loyalty to the Tsar could be preserved if only their legitimate grievances were addressed. The petition that Gapon drafted for presentation to the Tsar was a masterpiece of humble supplication combined with revolutionary demands. It began with traditional expressions of loyalty and faith in the Little Father's benevolence, but it went on to demand an 8-hour working day, a minimum wage, freedom of speech and assembly, and the convocation of a constituent assembly elected by universal suffrage. Gapon genuinely believed that if the workers could reach the Tsar directly, bypassing the corrupt officials who surrounded him, Nicholas would respond with the compassion and justice that his people expected from their divinely appointed ruler. It was a naive belief, but one that was shared by thousands of workers who had grown up believing in the myth of the good Tsar misled by evil advisors. The procession that formed on the morning of January 9, 1905, was unlike anything St. Petersburg had ever seen. Over 100,000 workers and their families gathered at various points around the city, carrying icons, portraits of the Tsar, and church banners. They sang hymns and patriotic songs as they marched toward the Winter Palace, their breath forming clouds in the bitter cold. These were not revolutionaries in any conventional sense. They were ordinary Russian workers, many of them peasants who had come to the city in search of a better life. They genuinely believed in the Tsar's goodness and in the possibility that their suffering could be alleviated through his intervention. The children who marched alongside their parents had no understanding of politics or revolution. They simply trusted that their little father would help them if only he could see their need. Father Gapon walked at the head of the main procession, wearing his priestly robes and carrying a cross. He had spent the previous night in prayer, convinced that God would protect the peaceful demonstration and touch the Tsar's heart with compassion for his suffering people. As the crowds converged on Palace Square, Gapon still believed that this would be the day when autocracy would show its human face and begin the process of peaceful reform. But the Tsar was not in the Winter Palace that morning. Nicholas had been advised by his security chiefs to leave the capital rather than risk a confrontation with the demonstrators. The magnificent Baroque facade of the palace, with its hundreds of windows reflecting the winter sun, looked down on the approaching crowds with the same cold indifference that had characterized the regime's response to popular suffering for generations. The troops that had been stationed around the palace had no orders to negotiate or to accept petitions. They had been told that this was a revolutionary uprising that threatened the stability of the empire. When the crowds pressed forward, singing and praying, the soldiers saw not peaceful supplicants, but dangerous rebels who needed to be dispersed by whatever means necessary. The first shots rang out as the procession approached the Narva Gate, one of the traditional entry points to the city center. Workers at the front of the march fell to the ground, their blood staining the snow red. The singing stopped, replaced by screams of terror and confusion as people tried to understand what was happening. The massacre that followed would be remembered as Bloody Sunday, the day when the people's faith in their Tsar died forever. By evening, over 1,000 men, women, and children lay dead in the snow, their bodies scattered across the squares and streets of the imperial capital. Father Gapon, who had escaped the slaughter, would later write that on that day, "There is no God any longer. There is no Tsar." The revolution had begun. The shots that echoed across Palace Square on that frozen January morning didn't just kill over 1,000 innocent people. They killed something far more precious and irreplaceable: the mystical bond between the Russian people and their Tsar that had sustained the monarchy for 3 centuries. In a single day, the little father became just another ruler who shed the blood of his own subjects. News of Bloody Sunday spread across the empire with the speed of wildfire. Telegraph operators, many of them sympathetic to the workers' cause, ensured that reports reached even the most remote corners of Russia within hours. In factory towns and peasant villages, in university lecture halls and army barracks, Russians struggled to comprehend what had happened in their capital. The immediate reaction was one of stunned disbelief. How could the Tsar, who was supposed to be the protector of his people, order the massacre of workers who had come to him in peace? Many refused to believe that Nicholas himself had authorized the shooting. Surely, they reasoned, evil ministers had acted without his knowledge. But as the truth became clear, disbelief gave way to rage. In St. Petersburg itself, the aftermath was immediate and dramatic. By evening, barricades had appeared in the working-class districts. Students poured out of the universities to join workers in building makeshift fortifications from overturned carriages, torn-up paving stones, and anything else they could find. The red flag of revolution, which had existed mainly in the theoretical writings of underground circles, suddenly appeared on rooftops and factory walls across the city. The government's response revealed the fundamental weakness of the autocratic system. Having ruled through a combination of mystical authority and brute force, the regime had no middle ground to fall back on when both failed simultaneously. Nicholas and his advisors could only think in terms of further repression, even as it became clear that repression alone was no longer sufficient to maintain order. General strikes erupted across the empire with unprecedented speed and coordination. The railway workers, whose labor was essential to holding the vast country together, walked off their jobs in a display of solidarity that paralyzed transportation. Factory after factory fell silent as workers abandoned their machines to join the growing protest movement. Even government employees, traditionally the most loyal servants of the regime, began to organize their own unions and demand political reforms. The peasants, initially slower to react than their urban counterparts, soon added their voices to the chorus of rebellion. In province after province, rural communities rose up against local landlords and government officials. Manor houses burned across the countryside as peasants seized the land they had dreamed of owning for generations. The smoke from these fires could be seen for miles, creating an apocalyptic landscape that seemed to announce the end of the old world. What made the 1905 revolution different from earlier peasant uprisings was its scope and coordination. This was not a series of isolated local rebellions, but a synchronized assault on the entire structure of autocratic rule. The telegraph lines that the government had built to strengthen its control now carried revolutionary messages. The railways that had been designed to move troops quickly to trouble spots were blocked by striking workers. In the universities, students organized themselves into revolutionary councils that coordinated with workers' committees and peasant organizations. The artificial barriers that had separated different classes of Russian society began to break down as educated intellectuals found themselves working alongside illiterate factory hands in pursuit of common goals. The revolution was creating its own forms of democratic organization even as it destroyed the institutions of the old regime. The liberal nobility, who had long advocated for gradual constitutional reform, suddenly found themselves swept up in events that moved far faster than they had ever imagined possible. Men who had spent years writing careful memoranda about the need for modest changes now discovered that the Russian people were demanding nothing less than the complete transformation of their political system. Count Sergei Vita, perhaps the most capable statesman in the Tsar's service, understood immediately that Bloody Sunday had changed everything. In urgent reports to Nicholas, he warned that the government faced a choice between meaningful reform and complete collapse. The old system of pure autocracy was finished, he argued. The only question was whether it would be replaced by constitutional monarchy or by something far more radical. But the Tsar and his closest advisors remained trapped in their obsolete worldview. They convinced themselves that the unrest was the work of foreign agitators and Jewish conspirators rather than the authentic expression of popular grievances. This willful blindness to reality would prove to be one of their greatest mistakes, ensuring that when they finally did make concessions, it would be too little and too late. The revolutionaries themselves were initially as surprised by the scope of their success as the government was by the scale of its failure. The underground organizations that had spent decades preparing for revolution suddenly found themselves leading a mass movement that had erupted spontaneously. Secret printing presses that had produced a few hundred copies of illegal pamphlets now struggled to meet the demand for revolutionary literature from millions of newly awakened Russians. Vladimir Lenin, still in exile in Switzerland, could hardly believe the reports reaching him from Russia. The theoretical revolution he had written about for years was actually happening, but it was unfolding in ways that no Marxist textbook had predicted. The proletariat was indeed rising up, but so were the peasants, the students, the liberal professionals, and even some members of the nobility. Russia was experiencing not a classic proletarian revolution, but something unprecedented. A popular uprising that cut across all class lines. Leon Trotsky, who managed to return to Russia during the chaos of 1905, was struck by the creativity and spontaneity of the revolutionary movement. Workers who had never heard of Marx were organizing themselves into councils that resembled the democratic institutions described in socialist theory. Peasants who couldn't read were implementing land redistribution schemes that paralleled the programs of radical political parties. The revolution was teaching itself as it developed, creating new forms of organization and struggle that would influence revolutionary movements around the world for decades to come. The workers' councils, or Soviets, that emerged in St. Petersburg and other industrial centers represented a genuine form of direct democracy that had rarely been seen in human history. Representatives were elected by their fellow workers, could be recalled at any time, and were expected to report back regularly on their activities. These Soviets became alternative centers of power that challenged the government's authority in the most fundamental way possible. By demonstrating that ordinary people could govern themselves without kings or bureaucrats. The St. Petersburg Soviet, led by the young Trotsky, began issuing its own decrees, organizing its own security forces, and even attempting to establish its own financial system. The military, which had always been the ultimate foundation of Tsarist power, began to show dangerous signs of unreliability. The humiliating defeats in the war against Japan had already damaged military morale, and news of Bloody Sunday completed the process of disillusionment. Soldiers began to question why they should shoot their own countrymen to protect a system that seemed to care nothing for the welfare of the people. The most dramatic military mutiny occurred aboard the battleship Potemkin in the Black Sea, where sailors killed their officers and attempted to spark a general naval uprising. Though the Potemkin mutiny was ultimately unsuccessful, it sent shockwaves through the officer corps and demonstrated that even the military elite could no longer take the loyalty of their men for granted. In army garrisons across the empire, soldiers began forming their own committees and demanding better treatment, higher pay, and an end to the brutal discipline that had characterized military service. Officers found themselves caught between their loyalty to the Tsar and their recognition that their men's grievances were often justified. Some sided with the revolution, while others tried desperately to maintain discipline through increasingly harsh measures. The ethnic minorities of the Russian Empire, who had long chafed under policies of forced Russification, saw the revolution as an opportunity to assert their national rights. In Poland, which had been incorporated into the empire after a series of failed uprisings, nationalist organizations merged with socialist groups to create a powerful independence movement. Finnish activists demanded the restoration of their country's traditional autonomy, which had been gradually eroded by Russian officials. In the Caucasus, Georgian and Armenian revolutionaries organized their own uprisings, while in the Baltic provinces, Estonian and Latvian peasants seized German-owned estates and proclaimed their intention to govern themselves. The empire that had been held together by force and bureaucratic centralization suddenly faced the prospect of complete disintegration as its constituent peoples demanded the right to determine their own futures. The Jewish population of the empire, which had long been subjected to discriminatory laws and periodic pogroms, found themselves in a particularly complex situation. Many Jewish intellectuals and workers enthusiastically supported the revolution, seeing it as their best hope for achieving equal rights. At the same time, the government and right-wing organizations deliberately fomented anti-Semitic violence as a way of dividing the revolutionary movement and channeling popular anger away from the regime. The pogroms that swept through the western provinces of the empire in 1905 were among the most savage in Russian history. Entire Jewish communities were destroyed by mobs that had been organized and armed by government officials. The international outcry over these atrocities further damaged Russia's reputation and made it clear that the regime was willing to use the most brutal methods to maintain its grip on power. By the autumn of 1905, Russia was in a state of virtual civil war. Large parts of the countryside were under the control of peasant communes that had expelled government officials and redistributed land according to their own concepts of justice. Major cities were governed by revolutionary committees that ignored orders from St. Petersburg. The empire's finances were in ruins as tax collection became impossible and foreign investors fled the chaos. It was at this moment of supreme crisis that Count Witte finally convinced the Tsar to make the concessions that might have preserved the monarchy if they had been offered earlier. The October Manifesto, issued on October 17, 1905, promised a constitution, an elected parliament, and basic civil liberties. It was a dramatic reversal of centuries of autocratic tradition, but it came only after the revolution had already achieved most of its immediate goals through direct action. The response to the October Manifesto revealed the deep divisions within Russian society that the revolution had temporarily papered over. Liberals and moderate socialists were inclined to accept the Tsar's promises and work within the new constitutional framework. But more radical elements, led by the Bolsheviks and other revolutionary parties, denounced the manifesto as a trick designed to divide the opposition and preserve the essential features of the old system. The workers of St. Petersburg, organized through their Soviet, initially rejected the manifesto and called for continued struggle until the complete overthrow of the autocracy. But as the government began to regain its confidence and reassert its authority, the revolutionary movement found itself increasingly isolated. The middle classes, frightened by the scale of popular violence and satisfied with the promise of constitutional government, began to withdraw their support from the more radical elements. The Moscow uprising of December 1905 represented the last great effort of the revolutionary forces to overthrow the regime through direct action. For 9 days, workers and students fought government troops in the streets of Russia's ancient capital, building barricades and holding entire districts against military assault. The fighting was savage, with both sides showing little mercy to their opponents. But the Moscow uprising also demonstrated the limitations of the revolutionary movement. Despite months of strikes and uprisings, the revolutionaries had failed to win over the army as a whole. Most soldiers, whatever their personal sympathies, continued to obey orders and fight for the government. Without military support, even the most dedicated revolutionaries could not hope to overthrow a regime that still controlled the instruments of organized violence. The suppression of the Moscow uprising marked the beginning of the end for the 1905 revolution. Over the following months, the government systematically restored its authority through a combination of limited concessions to moderate opinion and brutal repression of radical elements. Thousands of revolutionaries were executed or exiled to Siberia. The workers' Soviets were dissolved and their leaders arrested. Yet the revolution had achieved something unprecedented in Russian history. For the first time, the absolute power of the Tsar had been successfully challenged by his own people. The October Manifesto, however reluctantly granted, established the principle that the Russian people had rights that even the autocrat could not violate. The new parliament, or Duma, provided a forum where opposition voices could be heard and where the government could be held accountable for its actions. More importantly, the revolution had awakened political consciousness among millions of Russians who had previously accepted their subordination as natural and inevitable. Workers had learned that they could organize themselves and fight for their interests. Peasants had discovered that they could seize land and redistribute it according to their own sense of justice. Students and intellectuals had experienced the intoxicating possibility of creating a truly democratic society. The lessons of 1905 would not be forgotten. In underground meeting rooms and peasant huts, in factory workshops and university lecture halls, Russians continued to discuss the ideas and experiences that the revolution had brought to the surface. The old order had survived, but it had been permanently weakened. The next time the regime faced a serious crisis, it would discover that the Russian people were no longer willing to suffer in silence. The Tsar and his advisors, however, drew very different lessons from their experience. Instead of recognizing that 1905 had demonstrated the need for fundamental reform, they convinced themselves that they had successfully defeated a dangerous rebellion through firmness and resolve. They began the systematic process of rolling back the concessions they had made under duress, confident that they had restored the natural order of Russian society. This interpretation of events would prove to be their final and most fatal error. By treating 1905 as an aberration rather than a warning, the regime ensured that when the next crisis came, it would find itself facing an even more determined and experienced revolutionary movement. The dress rehearsal, as Lenin would later call the 1905 revolution, had ended. But the main performance was yet to come. As the immediate excitement of revolution faded and Russia settled into an uneasy peace, thoughtful observers could see that the fundamental problems that had caused the uprising remained unresolved. The peasants still lacked the land they desperately wanted. The workers still faced exploitation and poverty. The educated classes still chafed under political restrictions that seemed increasingly anachronistic in the 20th century. The revolution had opened doors that could never be completely closed again. Ideas about democracy, social justice, and national self-determination had taken root in Russian soil and would continue to grow despite government efforts to suppress them. The next time these ideas flowered into revolution, they would prove strong enough to uproot not just the Romanov dynasty, but the entire world that had created it. But that final reckoning still lay more than a decade in the future. For now, as the snows of another Russian winter covered the bloodstains in Palace Square, the empire settled into what would prove to be its final period of relative calm. It was a deceptive tranquility, masking the deeper currents that would soon sweep away everything that generations of Russians had taken for granted about their society and their place in the world. The Duma that convened in 1906 represented something genuinely unprecedented in Russian history. For the first time in 3 centuries, elected representatives of the Russian people sat in the Taurid Palace, debating the empire's future with an authority that derived not from imperial appointment, but from popular mandate. The very existence of this parliament, however limited its powers, marked a fundamental shift in the nature of Russian governance. Yet from its very first session, the Duma found itself locked in conflict with the regime that had reluctantly created it. The electoral system, hastily devised by government officials who had no experience with democratic processes, had produced results that horrified the Tsar and his advisors. Instead of compliant representatives grateful for their inclusion in government, the Duma was dominated by liberals and radicals who treated their election as a mandate for fundamental reform. The peasant deputies, many of whom had never seen St. Petersburg before, arrived at the capital with a simple and revolutionary demand. All land should belong to those who worked it. They spoke with the authentic voice of rural Russia, describing conditions that most government officials preferred to ignore. Their rough clothes and unpolished manners offended the sensibilities of court society, but their moral authority was undeniable. The liberal constitutional Democrats, led by the historian Pavel Milyukov, demanded a full parliamentary system with ministerial responsibility to the Duma rather than the Tsar. They pointed to the examples of Britain and France, where constitutional monarchy had evolved into genuine democracy while preserving traditional institutions. Their speeches were learned and eloquent, but they fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the regime they were trying to reform. Nicholas II had agreed to the creation of the Duma only under extreme duress, and he never accepted its legitimacy in any meaningful sense. He continued to believe that his authority came directly from God and that any limitation on his power was a betrayal of his sacred trust. The concessions of 1905 had been tactical retreats, not permanent surrenders of autocratic prerogative. The government's strategy became clear within months of the Duma's opening. Unable to work with an assembly that demanded real power, the regime would simply dissolve it and try again with more restrictive electoral laws. The first Duma lasted only 73 days before Nicholas dismissed it for excessive demands. The second Duma, elected in 1907, lasted barely 3 months before meeting the same fate. The third Duma, elected under a new law that dramatically reduced the representation of workers and peasants while increasing that of landlords and wealthy urbanites, proved more manageable from the government's perspective. This assembly, which sat from 1907 to 1912, included a significant number of conservatives who were willing to work within the existing system rather than challenge it fundamentally. Yet even this carefully gerrymandered parliament demonstrated the impossibility of returning to pure autocracy. Debates in the Duma were reported in newspapers throughout the empire, giving ordinary Russians unprecedented insight into government policy and decision-making. Opposition deputies used their parliamentary immunity to criticize officials and policies that had previously been beyond public challenge. The prime minister who emerged from this constitutional experiment was Pyotr Stolypin, a former provincial governor who understood better than most the depth of Russia's social problems. Stolypin was a conservative who had no sympathy for revolutionary politics, but he recognized that the regime's survival depended on addressing the legitimate grievances that had fueled the 1905 uprising. His most ambitious initiative was agrarian reform designed to break up the traditional peasant commune and create a class of independent farmers who would have a stake in preserving social order. Under Stolypin's reforms, individual peasants could withdraw from the commune and consolidate their scattered strips of land into private farms. The government provided loans and technical assistance to encourage this transformation. The Stolypin reforms represented a genuine attempt to modernize Russian agriculture and create a prosperous peasantry that would serve as a bulwark against revolution. In some regions, particularly in Western Russia, the reforms showed promising results. Enterprising peasants who had been held back by communal restrictions began to improve their farming methods and increase their productivity. But the reforms also created new tensions in the countryside. Peasants who withdrew from the commune were often resented by their neighbors, who saw them as selfish individualists abandoning the collective solidarity that had sustained rural communities for centuries. Violence between communal peasants and individual farmers became increasingly common, adding another layer of conflict to an already turbulent society. Moreover, the reforms did nothing to address the fundamental problem of rural overpopulation. Russia's peasant population was growing faster than the available land could support, creating pressures that no amount of agricultural improvement could relieve. Millions of young peasants continued to migrate to the cities, swelling the ranks of the industrial working class and bringing their grievances with them. Stolypin's political career ended abruptly in 1911 when he was assassinated by a revolutionary who was also, mysteriously, a police informant. His death deprived the regime of its most capable reformer and marked the end of serious attempts to address Russia's social problems through legal means. The government that succeeded him was far more conservative and much less willing to contemplate change. The years between 1907 and 1914 witnessed a remarkable cultural flowering that seemed to contradict the political tensions simmering beneath the surface of Russian society. This was the age of the Russian ballet, when Diaghilev's company conquered Paris and London with its innovative productions. Russian composers like Stravinsky and Rachmaninoff were creating music that would influence generations of artists around the world. In literature, this period saw the mature works of Tolstoy and Chekhov, along with the emergence of new voices like Maxim Gorky, who wrote about the lives of workers and peasants with unprecedented realism and sympathy. Russian poetry experienced a renaissance with figures like Alexander Blok and Anna Akhmatova, creating verses that captured both the beauty and the tragedy of their troubled homeland. The visual arts flourished as well, with painters like Kandinsky and Chagall pioneering abstract and expressionist techniques that would reshape modern art. Russian theaters staged innovative productions that influenced dramatic theory throughout Europe. It seemed as though the creative energies unleashed by political upheaval were finding expression in every form of artistic endeavor. Yet this cultural brilliance coexisted with deepening social divisions and political instability. The industrial economy continued to grow rapidly, creating enormous wealth for a small class of entrepreneurs, while leaving the mass of workers little better off than before. The gap between rich and poor was becoming more visible and more resented as consumer goods became available to those who could afford them, while remaining beyond the reach of ordinary Russians. The revolutionary underground, though weakened by government repression, had not disappeared. In exile, Lenin was developing his theories of revolutionary organization and strategy, convinced that 1905 had been only the first act in a drama that would eventually destroy the Tsarist system. Other revolutionary leaders were drawing similar conclusions, preparing for the next crisis that would give them another opportunity to overthrow the old order. The workers who had formed the backbone of the 1905 revolution retained their political consciousness, even as their organizations were suppressed. In factory workshops and workers' clubs, they continued to discuss the ideas that had inspired their earlier uprising. The memory of what they had achieved during those heady months of revolution served as proof that change was possible if they could unite and act decisively. The peasants, too, had not forgotten the lessons of 1905. In village assemblies and rural markets, they talked about the land redistributions they had carried out and the manor houses they had burned. The Stolypin reforms had given some peasants individual property, but millions more remained landless or nearly landless, dreaming of the day when they could claim the estates of their former masters. The ethnic minorities of the empire had also learned valuable lessons from their participation in the revolution. Polish, Finnish, Georgian, and other nationalist movements had developed organizational skills and political programs that would serve them well in future struggles. The experience of working together across ethnic lines had also created networks of cooperation that transcended traditional boundaries. Even within the government itself, there were officials who understood that the post-1905 settlement was unstable and unsustainable. Reports from provincial governors described mounting social tensions and warned of the possibility of new upheavals. But these warnings were largely ignored by decision-makers in St. Petersburg, who preferred to believe that order had been permanently restored. The international situation was also becoming increasingly precarious. Russia's defeat by Japan had damaged its prestige as a great power, while the internal upheavals of 1905 had raised questions about the empire's stability. European diplomats watched nervously as Russia struggled to maintain its position in a rapidly changing world. The alliance system that was taking shape in Europe placed Russia in an increasingly difficult position. The Franco-Russian alliance, originally designed to counter German power, was drawing the empire into conflicts that had little direct relevance to Russian interests. The rivalry with Austria-Hungary in the Balkans was creating tensions that could easily escalate into a larger European war. Military leaders were acutely aware of the empire's vulnerabilities. The army that had performed so poorly against Japan was being reformed and re-equipped, but progress was slow and uneven. The officer corps remained divided between those who supported modernization and those who clung to traditional methods. The rank-and-file soldiers, drawn primarily from the peasantry, brought their social grievances with them into military service. The Navy, almost completely destroyed in the war with Japan, was being rebuilt with modern battleships and cruisers. But naval construction was expensive and time-consuming, and Russia remained vulnerable to any power that could challenge its sea communications. The Baltic and Black Sea fleets were isolated from each other and could not provide mutual support in case of conflict. Russia's industrial capacity was growing rapidly, but it remained heavily dependent on foreign investment and technology. French and British capital had financed much of the empire's railroad construction and industrial development, creating economic relationships that could become political liabilities in case of international conflict. The country's financial system was also vulnerable to external shocks that could disrupt the flow of foreign credit. The educational system was producing increasing numbers of trained professionals, but many of them could not find employment appropriate to their qualifications. Universities were graduating lawyers, doctors, engineers, and teachers faster than the economy could absorb them, creating a class of educated but frustrated individuals who were naturally attracted to opposition politics. The press, despite government censorship, was becoming more sophisticated and influential. Newspapers and magazines reached audiences that had never before had access to information about national and international affairs. Even government efforts to control information were often counterproductive, as censorship itself became a subject of public debate and criticism. Religious life was also changing in ways that challenged traditional authority. The Orthodox Church, closely identified with the autocratic state, was losing influence among educated Russians who were attracted to more personal forms of spirituality. Sectarian movements that emphasized individual religious experience were growing rapidly, particularly among the peasantry. The Jewish population, despite continued legal discrimination, was playing an increasingly important role in the empire's economic and intellectual life. Jewish entrepreneurs were prominent in banking, commerce, and industry, while Jewish intellectuals contributed disproportionately to revolutionary movements and cultural innovation. Anti-Semitic policies not only wasted human resources, but also created internal enemies of the regime. As 1914 approached, all of these social, economic, political, and cultural tensions were building toward another crisis that would test the regime's ability to survive. The government's strategy of limited reform combined with selective repression had created a temporary stability. But it had not resolved the fundamental contradictions that had caused the 1905 revolution. The educated classes remained alienated from a government that refused to share real power with elected representatives. The workers continued to face exploitation and poverty that made them receptive to revolutionary appeals. The peasants still lacked the land they believed was rightfully theirs. The ethnic minorities remained subject to discriminatory policies that denied their legitimate aspirations. Most ominously, the regime had lost the mystical authority that had sustained it for centuries. The massacre of Bloody Sunday had shattered the bond between the Tsar and his people, while the subsequent political conflicts had revealed the government's weakness and incompetence. Nicholas II was no longer the little father beloved by his subjects, but simply another fallible ruler struggling to maintain his grip on power. The final crisis, when it came, would not emerge from internal contradictions alone. It would be triggered by Russia's involvement in a European war that would expose all of the empire's weaknesses simultaneously. The military would prove inadequate to the demands of modern warfare. The economy would collapse under the strain of mobilization. The government would lose whatever legitimacy it had retained after 1905. But in 1914, as Europe stumbled toward the catastrophe that would reshape the continent, Few Russians could imagine the scope of the disaster that awaited them. The empire that had survived Napoleon and weathered the storms of 1905 seemed solid enough to endure whatever challenges the future might bring. The revolution that would finally destroy the old order was still 3 years away, hidden in the fog of an uncertain future. The stage was set, the actors were in place, and the forces that would drive the final act of the Romanov dynasty were gathering strength. But for now, in the deceptive calm of the pre-war years, Russia slumbered on, unaware that it was about to enter the most traumatic period in its long and troubled history. The real revolution, the one that would sweep away not just the Tsar but the entire world that had created him, was about to begin. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, sent shockwaves across Europe that would ultimately reach the very heart of the Russian Empire. Few events in history have had consequences so disproportionate to their immediate cause. A single pistol shot fired by a young Serbian nationalist would set in motion a chain of events that would destroy 4 empires and reshape the political map of the world. For Russia, the crisis that followed the assassination presented both opportunity and mortal danger. The empire's pan-Slavic commitments and its rivalry with Austria-Hungary in the Balkans made it almost inevitable that St. Petersburg would support Serbia against Austrian demands for retribution. What Russian leaders failed to grasp was that this regional conflict would escalate into a global war that would expose every weakness in their creaking imperial system. The decision-making process that led Russia into World War I revealed the fundamental flaws in the autocratic system that had governed the empire for centuries. Nicholas II, still believing in his divine right to rule, made crucial decisions based on emotion and dynastic pride, rather than careful analysis of Russia's capabilities and interests. His foreign minister, Sergei Sazonov, was an experienced diplomat, but lacked the authority to restrain his sovereign when the Tsar's blood was up. The mobilization that began in late July 1914 was presented to the Russian people as a defense of Slavic brothers against Germanic aggression. Orthodox priests blessed the troops as they marched off to war, while patriotic demonstrations filled the streets of St. Petersburg and Moscow. The capital itself was hastily renamed Petrograd to remove its Germanic associations, a symbolic gesture that reflected the anti-German hysteria sweeping through Russian society. But beneath the surface of patriotic enthusiasm lay deeper currents of anxiety and foreboding. The educated classes, who remembered the disasters of the Russo-Japanese War, wondered whether the empire was really prepared for a major European conflict. The workers, whose living standards were already precarious, feared what wartime shortages might bring. The peasants, who would provide the bulk of the army's manpower, had little understanding of the issues at stake, but knew from bitter experience that wars were fought with their blood. The initial military campaigns seemed to justify the optimists' confidence. Russian armies swept into East Prussia and Galicia, winning spectacular victories that brought hundreds of thousands of Austrian prisoners into Russian camps. General Brusilov's offensive in 1916 would prove to be one of the most successful operations in the entire war, demonstrating that Russian soldiers could fight as effectively as any in Europe when properly led and equipped. But these tactical successes masked strategic weaknesses that would prove fatal to the imperial system. Russia's industrial base, though growing rapidly, was simply inadequate to support a modern army of millions of men. The transportation system, centered on the Trans-Siberian Railway and a few north-south lines, could not efficiently move troops and supplies to where they were needed. The officer corps, decimated by early casualties, increasingly relied on inexperienced commanders who sent their men into hopeless attacks. Most critically, the government proved incapable of managing the enormous economic and social disruption that total war brought to Russian society. The mobilization of millions of peasants disrupted agricultural production, just as the army's demand for food was reaching unprecedented levels. The conversion of factories to munitions production created shortages of consumer goods that drove up prices and created hardship for urban populations. The railway system, already strained by military requirements, began to break down under the impossible burden of moving troops, supplies, and refugees simultaneously. Coal shortages meant that trains ran irregularly, while the breakdown of the telegraph system made coordination between different parts of the empire increasingly difficult. By 1916, it was taking weeks for orders from Petrograd to reach commanders at the front. The human cost of the war was staggering beyond anything Russia had ever experienced. Casualty reports spoke of hundreds of thousands killed, wounded, or missing, but these statistics could not convey the reality of villages that had lost all their young men or families, that had received no news of sons and husbands for months at a time. Refugee columns from the western provinces clogged the roads, bringing tales of destruction and defeat that contradicted official reports of victory. In the hospitals of Petrograd and Moscow, the Tsarina Alexandra threw herself into nursing work with a dedication that might have redeemed her reputation if circumstances had been different. But her German origins, combined with persistent rumors about her relationship with the mysterious Rasputin, made her a target for criticism that inevitably reflected on the monarchy itself. Every German military success was attributed by conspiracy theorists to treachery in high places. The figure of Grigory Rasputin loomed ever larger over the imperial family as the war progressed. This Siberian peasant, whose apparent ability to help the hemophiliac heir Alexei had given him unprecedented access to the royal couple, became a symbol of everything that was wrong with the autocratic system. His dissolute lifestyle and political interference outraged public opinion and provided ammunition for the regime's enemies. Rasputin's influence over government appointments during the war years was particularly damaging to the monarchy's credibility. Ministers were dismissed and appointed based on the holy man's whims rather than their qualifications, creating chaos in the administration just when competent leadership was most needed. The public perception that a drunken peasant was effectively ruling the empire while the Tsar played at being a military commander did enormous damage to whatever legitimacy the monarchy retained. The Duma, which had been marginalized since 1907, began to reassert itself as the government's failures became impossible to ignore. Liberal deputies like Pavel Milyukov delivered devastating speeches cataloging the regime's incompetence and corruption. The formation of the Progressive Bloc in 1915 brought together moderate conservatives and liberals in an unprecedented challenge to autocratic rule. But Nicholas II, still convinced of his divine mission, refused to share real power with elected representatives. His decision to assume personal command of the army in 1915 was intended to demonstrate his commitment to victory, but it had the opposite effect. Every military defeat now reflected directly on the Tsar himself, while his absence from the capital left the government in the hands of his unpopular wife and her sinister advisor. The economic situation deteriorated rapidly as the war entered its third year. Inflation soared as the government printed money to finance military expenditures, while shortages of essential goods created black markets and corruption. The breadlines that formed in Petrograd and other cities became gathering points for political agitation, as hungry citizens listened to speakers who blamed their suffering on the incompetence and treachery of their rulers. Industrial workers, whose patriotic enthusiasm had evaporated as their living conditions worsened, began to organize strikes and demonstrations reminiscent of 1905. The difference was that this time, the government lacked the resources to crush dissent through massive repression. Too many troops were needed at the front, while those who remained in the rear were increasingly unreliable. The peasants in uniform who made up the bulk of the army were growing war-weary and demoralized. Letters from home told of families struggling to survive without their menfolk, while officers spoke openly of the hopelessness of continuing a war that seemed to serve no purpose beyond satisfying the vanity of incompetent leaders. Desertion rates climbed steadily as soldiers simply walked away from the front to return to their villages. The revolutionary underground, scattered and weakened after 1905, began to reorganize as the war created new opportunities for agitation. Lenin, still in Swiss exile, analyzed the conflict as an imperialist war that would inevitably lead to revolution in the participating countries. His slogan of turning the imperialist war into a civil war seemed increasingly relevant as social tensions reached the breaking point. Other revolutionary leaders, both inside Russia and in exile, reached similar conclusions. The war was destroying the old order more effectively than decades of revolutionary activity had managed to do. The task now was to be ready when the moment came to seize power from the discredited autocracy and build something entirely new on the ruins of the old regime. The educated classes, who had initially supported the war effort, became increasingly alienated as the government's failures mounted. Professional associations, universities, and even government departments began to organize themselves independently of official authority. The zemstvos, local government bodies that had been marginalized by the autocracy, stepped in to provide services that the central government could no longer deliver. This spontaneous self-organization of civil society represented a profound challenge to the autocratic principle that all authority must flow from the Tsar. Russian society was learning to govern itself, creating institutions and networks that operated independently of official sanction. When the final crisis came, these alternative structures would be ready to step into the vacuum left by the collapse of imperial authority. The year 1916 brought a series of disasters that finally convinced even conservative Russians that the existing system was doomed. Military defeats on multiple fronts cost hundreds of thousands of casualties while achieving nothing of strategic value. The economic situation reached the point where even middle-class families struggled to obtain basic necessities. Most damaging of all, scandals involving Rasputin reached such proportions that they became the subject of international attention. The murder of Rasputin in December 1916 by a group of aristocratic conspirators was intended to save the monarchy by removing its most notorious symbol of corruption. Prince Felix Yusupov and his co-conspirators genuinely believed that eliminating the holy man would restore public confidence in the Tsar and enable the regime to prosecute the war more effectively. Instead, Rasputin's death only highlighted the monarchy's isolation and weakness. The fact that members of the highest nobility felt compelled to resort to murder demonstrated that the normal political processes had completely broken down. The Tsarina's grief over her advisor's death further estranged her from public opinion, while the Tsar's inability to punish the conspirators revealed his political impotence. As 1917 dawned, Russia was an empire living on borrowed time. The military situation was hopeless, with demoralized armies facing inevitable defeat. The economic system was collapsing under the strain of total war. The government had lost all credibility and was widely seen as incompetent, corrupt, and possibly treasonous. Most ominously, alternative centers of power were emerging throughout society, from workers' committees to military units that elected their own leaders. The revolutionary moment was approaching with the inevitability of an avalanche. All that was needed was the right trigger, the spark that would ignite the accumulated grievances of decades into an explosion that would sweep away not just the Romanov dynasty, but the entire world that had created it. That spark would come from the most unlikely source: the breadlines of Petrograd, where hungry women would begin the revolution that would change the course of human history. In the factories and barracks, in the peasant villages and university lecture halls, Russians were preparing for a transformation that few could imagine and none could prevent. The old world was dying, and from its death throes would emerge something unprecedented in human experience. The stage was set for the final act of Imperial Russia, a drama that would unfold with breathtaking speed and world-shaking consequences. The winter of 1916 to 1917 was particularly harsh, even by Russian standards. Snow lay thick on the ground from the Baltic to the Pacific, while temperatures in Petrograd dropped to levels that made daily life almost unbearable. But the cold that gripped the capital was nothing compared to the chill that had settled over the hearts of its inhabitants as they contemplated their empire's seemingly hopeless situation. In the elegant drawing rooms of the nobility, conversations that had once centered on court gossip and social engagements now focused obsessively on the war's progress and the government's failures. Ladies who had spent their lives in pursuit of fashion and pleasure found themselves organizing hospitals and relief committees, trying to address problems that seemed to grow faster than any private charity could handle. The middle classes, shopkeepers and professionals who had formed the backbone of respectable society, watched their savings evaporate as inflation destroyed the value of money itself. A loaf of bread that had cost a few kopecks before the war now required rubles that many families simply did not possess. The social order that had seemed so stable just a few years earlier was crumbling before their eyes. But it was in the working-class districts that the real crisis was most acute. Families that had already been living on the margins of subsistence found themselves facing starvation as food shortages reached catastrophic proportions. The government's attempts to control prices through regulation only drove goods into black markets, where they commanded prices that ordinary workers could never afford. The women who stood in bread lines that stretched for blocks through the frozen streets of Petrograd were not professional revolutionaries or political agitators. They were mothers trying to feed their children, wives struggling to maintain their households while their husbands served at the front. But their patience, stretched thin by years of hardship, was finally reaching its breaking point. On February 23, 1917, which fell on March 8 according to the Western calendar, International Women's Day provided the occasion for demonstrations that began as protests against food shortages, but quickly evolved into something far more significant. Women textile workers in the Vyborg district left their factories and marched through the streets, calling on their sisters to join them in demanding bread, peace, and an end to the autocracy that had brought them such misery. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, thousands of women had joined the protests, and their demands had expanded beyond bread to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of Russian society. Why should they starve while nobles lived in luxury? Why should their sons die in a war that served no purpose they could understand? Why should they submit to a government that seemed incapable of protecting them or providing for their basic needs? The police, overwhelmed by the scale of the demonstrations, found themselves unable to maintain order through their usual methods of arrest and intimidation. The Cossacks, traditionally the most reliable supporters of the regime, showed dangerous signs of sympathy for the protesters. When ordered to charge the crowds, many Cossack units simply refused, while others actively fraternized with the demonstrators. By February 25th, what had begun as a women's protest about bread had become a general strike that paralyzed the capital. Factory after factory fell silent as workers abandoned their machines to join the growing crowds in the streets. Students poured out of universities, government employees left their offices, and even some police units began to question their loyalty to a regime that seemed to be collapsing before their eyes. The military garrison of Petrograd, composed largely of reserve units and training battalions, proved to be the weakest link in the government's defenses. These soldiers, many of them older men or new recruits, had little enthusiasm for firing on their own countrymen. When ordered to suppress the demonstrations, entire regiments mutinied and joined the revolution they had been sent to crush. The speed with which the imperial government collapsed caught everyone by surprise, including the revolutionaries themselves. Within a matter of days, the apparatus of autocratic rule that had governed Russia for centuries simply disintegrated. Police stations were burned, government buildings were occupied, and the symbols of Tsarist authority were torn down or defaced by jubilant crowds. Nicholas II, still at military headquarters hundreds of miles from the capital, seemed almost oblivious to the magnitude of the crisis engulfing his empire. His initial response was to order military units to restore order in Petrograd, apparently unaware that those units had already joined the revolution. When he finally decided to return to the capital, he found the railway lines blocked by revolutionary forces. The Duma, which had been dismissed by the Tsar just days before the revolution began, reconvened on its own authority and formed a provisional committee to restore order and establish a new government. Liberal politicians like Prince Georgy Lvov and Pavel Milyukov, who had spent years advocating for constitutional monarchy, suddenly found themselves responsible for managing a revolution that was rapidly moving beyond their control. Simultaneously, and in direct competition with the provisional government, workers and soldiers in Petrograd were organizing their own council or Soviet, based on the model that had emerged during the 1905 revolution. The Petrograd Soviet, as it became known, represented the direct democracy of the streets and factories rather than the parliamentary democracy favored by the liberals. This dual power structure, with the provisional government claiming legal authority while the Soviet wielded practical control over the capital's workers and soldiers, created an inherently unstable situation that would define the revolution's next phase. Neither institution had the strength to eliminate the other, but neither could govern effectively without the other's cooperation. The abdication of Nicholas II, when it finally came on March 2, 1917, was almost anticlimactic after the dramatic events of the previous week. Isolated in his railway car and abandoned by his generals, the last Tsar of Russia renounced the throne not only for himself, but also for his hemophiliac son, passing the crown to his brother, Grand Duke Michael. But Michael, recognizing the impossibility of his position, declined to accept the throne, effectively ending the Romanov dynasty that had ruled Russia for over 300 years. The news of the Tsar's abdication was greeted with wild celebrations throughout the empire. In Petrograd, crowds gathered in the streets to sing revolutionary songs and burn portraits of the fallen monarch. Soldiers tore the imperial eagles from their uniforms and elected committees to represent their interests. Political prisoners were released from the fortress of Peter and Paul, while revolutionary exiles began the long journey home from Siberia and foreign countries. But even as Russians celebrated their liberation from autocracy, thoughtful observers recognized that the real revolution had only just begun. The collapse of Tsarist authority had unleashed forces that no one fully understood or controlled. The question was no longer whether the old order would fall, but what would rise in its place. In the factories and barracks, in the peasant villages and ethnic borderlands, millions of Russians were beginning to organize themselves according to their own understanding of freedom and justice. Workers formed committees to control their factories. Soldiers elected officers and debated whether to continue fighting in a war they no longer supported. Peasants prepared to seize the land they had coveted for generations. National minorities began asserting their rights to self-determination. The liberal politicians who had assumed power in the provisional government genuinely believed they could channel these revolutionary energies into a Western-style parliamentary democracy. They drafted plans for a constituent assembly that would create a new constitution and establish Russia as a modern, democratic state. But their vision of gradual, legal reform was increasingly at odds with the radical demands emerging from the streets. The return of revolutionary leaders from exile and prison added new dynamics to an already complex situation. Lenin's arrival at the Finland station in April 1917, aided by the German government, which hoped to knock Russia out of the war, brought a clarity of purpose and revolutionary theory that the movement had previously lacked. His April theses, calling for immediate peace, bread, and land, along with all power to the Soviets, provided a program that spoke directly to the concerns of ordinary Russians. Other revolutionary figures, including Trotsky, who returned from American exile, and Stalin, who emerged from Siberian exile, brought their own perspectives and ambitions to the revolutionary movement. The competition between different revolutionary factions, combined with the fundamental conflict between the provisional government and the Soviet, created a volatile political situation that grew more unstable with each passing day. The continuation of the war, despite popular demands for peace, proved to be the provisional government's fatal weakness. Liberal politicians like Alexander Kerensky, who became the dominant figure in the government, believed that Russia had to honor its commitments to its allies and continue fighting until victory was achieved. But soldiers at the front and their families at home had had enough of a war that seemed to serve no purpose beyond enriching war profiteers and satisfying the ambitions of politicians. The military offensive launched by Kerensky in June 1917 was intended to demonstrate that democratic Russia could fight more effectively than the old autocracy. Instead, it resulted in catastrophic defeats that completed the demoralization of the army and discredited the provisional government in the eyes of those who had initially supported it. As the revolution entered its second phase, it became clear that the moderate course favored by the liberals was no longer viable. The forces unleashed by the February Revolution were too powerful to be contained within the framework of parliamentary democracy. Russia was moving toward a second, more radical revolution that would sweep away not just the remnants of the old order, but also the moderate politicians who had hoped to guide the country's transition to democracy. The stage was set for the dramatic events of October 1917, when Lenin and his Bolsheviks would seize power in the name of the workers, soldiers, and peasants who had already lost faith in the promises of their temporary rulers. The liberal dream of a democratic Russia would be swept aside by the revolutionary reality of a society that had moved far beyond the comfortable assumptions of parliamentary politics. But that final act of the revolutionary drama still lay ahead. For now, in the spring and summer of 1917, Russia existed in a state of creative chaos, where anything seemed possible and the future remained unwritten. It was a moment of extraordinary possibility and terrible danger. When the fate of the world's largest country hung in the balance and the choices made by ordinary people would determine the course of history for generations to come. The summer of 1917 brought no relief to Russia's revolutionary fever. If anything, the warm months only intensified the contradictions tearing the empire apart. In the countryside, peasants no longer waited for government permission to claim the land they believed was rightfully theirs. Village after village witnessed the same scene. Manor houses going up in flames while their former owners fled to the safety of the cities, carrying whatever possessions they could manage. The peasants who carried out these seizures were not acting from abstract political theory. They were driven by generations of accumulated grievances and the simple belief that those who worked the land should own it. Ancient boundaries were erased overnight as communal assemblies redistributed estates according to their own sense of justice. The careful legal procedures that the provisional government hoped would govern land reform were swept aside by the direct action of millions of rural Russians. In the cities, workers were conducting their own revolution within the revolution. Factory committees assumed control over production, hiring, and working conditions, often ignoring the protests of owners and managers who found themselves powerless to resist. The 8-hour working day, which labor activists had demanded for decades, was simply implemented by workers who walked off their jobs when they decided their shift was over. These workplace transformations went far beyond simple economic demands. Workers were experimenting with forms of industrial democracy that challenged the fundamental assumptions of capitalist production. Why should owners who never set foot in the factories control the lives of those who operated the machines? Why should profits flow to distant shareholders, while those who created the wealth lived in poverty? The army, meanwhile, was disintegrating as a fighting force, even as it remained a potent political actor. Soldiers' committees elected in the aftermath of the February Revolution had taken control of many units, debating orders from officers and often refusing to carry out operations they considered pointless or suicidal. The famous Order No. 1, issued by the Petrograd Soviet, had encouraged this democratization of military authority by declaring that soldiers should obey only those commands that did not conflict with the Soviets' directives. Desertion reached epidemic proportions as peasant soldiers simply walked away from the front to participate in the land redistributions taking place in their home villages. Entire divisions melted away as men decided that defending their families' claims to newly seized property was more important than fighting in a war whose purpose they no longer understood. The officer corps, already decimated by 3 years of warfare, found itself caught between loyalty to the provisional government and the practical impossibility of commanding troops who no longer recognized their authority. Many officers abandoned their units and made their way to areas controlled by anti-Bolshevik forces that were beginning to organize in southern Russia. Others attempted to maintain discipline through increasingly desperate measures that only accelerated the army's collapse. Alexander Kerensky, who had emerged as the dominant figure in the provisional government, struggled desperately to hold together a coalition that was being pulled apart by forces beyond his control. A gifted orator who had made his reputation defending political prisoners under the old regime, Kerensky genuinely believed that revolutionary Russia could transform itself into a Western-style democracy if given time and proper leadership. But time was precisely what the provisional government lacked. Each day brought new crises that demanded immediate attention, while the fundamental problems that had caused the revolution remained unresolved. The war continued to drain resources and lives while popular support for continued fighting evaporated. The economy spiraled deeper into chaos as transportation networks broke down and industrial production declined. Most critically, the government's authority was challenged daily by the growing power of the Soviets and other revolutionary organizations. Kerensky's attempt to balance between the demands of Russia's allies, who insisted on continued military cooperation, and the wishes of his own people, who wanted immediate peace, satisfied no one and further undermined his credibility. The June offensive, launched with great fanfare as proof of democratic Russia's military effectiveness, instead demonstrated the impossibility of conducting modern warfare with demoralized troops and inadequate supplies. The failure of the offensive had profound political consequences that extended far beyond military considerations. Soldiers who had been willing to give the new government a chance lost faith in leaders who seemed as disconnected from reality as the Tsar had been. Workers and peasants who had supported the provisional government's initial reforms began to question whether moderate politicians could deliver the fundamental changes they demanded. Into this political vacuum stepped Vladimir Lenin, whose return to Russia in April had electrified the revolutionary movement. Lenin's analysis of the situation was starkly different from that of other political leaders. While liberals and moderate socialists spoke of gradual reform and constitutional development, Lenin argued that Russia was ready for an immediate transition to socialism under the leadership of the Bolshevik Party. The April theses that Lenin presented upon his return seemed almost fantastical to many of his contemporaries. He called for the immediate overthrow of the provisional government, the transfer of all power to the Soviets, the nationalization of banks and major industries, and Russia's immediate withdrawal from the war. Even many Bolsheviks initially rejected these proposals as premature and unrealistic. But Lenin's seemingly impossible program had one crucial advantage. It spoke directly to the concerns of ordinary Russians who had lost patience with parliamentary procedures and diplomatic niceties. Soldiers wanted to go home. Workers wanted control over their workplaces. Peasants wanted land. Lenin promised all of these things immediately, without the endless delays and compromises that characterized the provisional government's approach. The growing influence of the Bolsheviks was evident in the changing composition and rhetoric of the Soviets throughout Russia. In Petrograd, the Soviet that had initially been dominated by moderate socialists gradually came under the influence of more radical elements who questioned the wisdom of continued cooperation with the provisional government. Similar shifts were occurring in Moscow, in industrial centers throughout the country, and even in some military units. Leon Trotsky's return from American exile in May added another powerful voice to the revolutionary chorus. A brilliant orator and organizer who had played a crucial role in the 1905 revolution, Trotsky initially maintained his independence from the Bolsheviks while supporting many of their positions. His theory of permanent revolution, which argued that the Russian Revolution would inevitably spread to other countries, provided an intellectual framework for understanding the global significance of events in Russia. The July days, when armed demonstrations in Petrograd demanded the transfer of power to the Soviets, revealed both the growing strength of radical sentiment and the continued weakness of revolutionary organization. The demonstrations began spontaneously among military units and workers frustrated with the provisional government's policies, but they lacked clear leadership and specific objectives beyond the general demand for change. The Bolsheviks, caught off guard by the sudden eruption of popular anger, found themselves in the awkward position of trying to lead a movement they had not initiated. Lenin himself was uncertain whether the moment was right for a direct challenge to the provisional government, recognizing that premature action could destroy the revolutionary movement just as it was gaining momentum. The provisional government's response to the July days demonstrated both its determination to survive and its increasing reliance on military force to maintain authority. Kerensky ordered troops loyal to the government to suppress the demonstrations, resulting in street fighting that left hundreds dead and wounded. The Bolshevik leadership was arrested or forced into hiding, while their newspapers were banned and their organizations disrupted. But the victory proved to be temporary and costly. The use of military force against demonstrators who were demanding the same goals that the February Revolution had supposedly achieved alienated many Russians who had initially supported the provisional government. More importantly, the crisis revealed the government's fundamental dependence on military units, whose loyalty was questionable at best. The appointment of General Laver Kornilov as commander-in-chief in July seemed to offer the provisional government the strong military leadership it desperately needed. Kornilov was a genuine war hero who commanded respect among officers and had a reputation for decisiveness that contrasted sharply with the government's apparent indecision. His appointment was welcomed by conservative politicians and military leaders who believed that only firm authority could restore order to the disintegrating empire. But Kornilov's vision of restoration involved far more than simply ending the revolution. He and his supporters dreamed of establishing a military dictatorship that would suppress all revolutionary organizations, restore discipline in the army, and continue the war until victory was achieved. This program was fundamentally incompatible with the democratic aspirations that had motivated the February Revolution, setting up a confrontation that would have decisive consequences for Russia's future. The Kornilov affair, which unfolded in late August 1917, represented the last serious attempt by conservative forces to halt the revolutionary process through military intervention. Kornilov's march on Petrograd, with troops he claimed were loyal to the provisional government, was intended to eliminate the Soviet and establish a regime capable of restoring order throughout the empire. The threat of military dictatorship had the paradoxical effect of revitalizing the revolutionary movement, just when it seemed to be weakening. Workers, soldiers, and radical politicians, who had been divided by tactical disagreements, united in opposition to what they saw as an attempt to restore the old order under new management. The Bolsheviks, recently suppressed and discredited, suddenly found themselves leading a broad coalition against counter-revolution. The failure of Kornilov's coup attempt was as swift and complete as its initiation had been dramatic. Railway workers prevented the movement of his troops by disabling locomotives and tearing up track. Telegraph operators spread word of the conspiracy, allowing revolutionary forces to organize resistance. Most critically, Kornilov's own soldiers, when they understood that they were being used against the revolution rather than the German enemy, refused to march on the capital that had recently celebrated its liberation from autocracy. The collapse of the Kornilov movement had profound consequences that extended far beyond the immediate military situation. The provisional government, which had been associated with the failed coup through its initial support for Kornilov, lost whatever credibility it had retained among the masses of Russian workers and soldiers. Kerensky's attempts to distance himself from the general he had appointed only emphasized his political weakness and poor judgment. More significantly, the Bolsheviks emerged from the crisis with enhanced prestige and renewed organizational strength. Their consistent opposition to military dictatorship, combined with their role in organizing resistance to Kornilov, rehabilitated them in the eyes of many Russians who had been suspicious of their radical program. The weapons distributed to workers' militias during the crisis remained in revolutionary hands, providing the military foundation for future action. The autumn of 1917 found Russia in a state of virtual anarchy that the provisional government was powerless to control. In the countryside, peasant communes were completing their seizure of noble estates, while local authorities either fled or joined the revolution. In the cities, workers' committees controlled most factories and often ignored government directives they considered contrary to their interests. In the army, soldiers' committees made their own decisions about whether to obey orders from officers they had not elected. The national minorities of the empire, emboldened by the central government's weakness, began asserting their independence in increasingly dramatic ways. Finland declared its autonomy, while Poland moved toward complete independence. In Ukraine, a nationalist government challenged Petrograd's authority over the empire's most productive agricultural region. The Baltic provinces, the Caucasus, and Central Asia all witnessed the emergence of movements that rejected Russian control. The provisional government's response to these centrifugal forces was confused and contradictory. Liberal politicians who had spent years advocating for decentralization found themselves trying to preserve the empire's unity against separatist movements they had inadvertently encouraged. Their attempts to maintain Russian control through negotiation and compromise satisfied neither Russian nationalists, who demanded forceful suppression of separatism, nor minority groups, who interpreted moderation as weakness. Economic collapse accelerated throughout the autumn as the breakdown of transportation and administration disrupted normal commercial relationships. Food shortages in the cities reached crisis proportions, while peasants hoarded grain rather than selling it for increasingly worthless paper money. Industrial production declined as raw materials became unavailable, and workers spent more time in political meetings than at their machines. The monetary system was collapsing under the weight of government borrowing and popular mistrust. The printing of paper money to finance government operations had created inflation that wiped out savings and made normal economic calculation impossible. Barter systems emerged in many regions as people lost faith in official currency, while local authorities began issuing their own money backed by whatever assets they controlled. Against this backdrop of social and economic disintegration, Lenin and the Bolsheviks began preparing for what they believed would be the final act of the revolutionary drama. The slogan, "All power to the Soviets," which had seemed premature in April, now appeared to many Russians as the only alternative to complete chaos. The provisional government's obvious inability to govern was creating a political vacuum that some organization would inevitably fill. The Bolsheviks' advantage lay not in their popular support, which remained limited to industrial workers and some military units, but in their organizational discipline and clarity of purpose. While other political parties debated and compromised, the Bolsheviks prepared for decisive action. Their willingness to promise immediate solutions to Russia's problems, regardless of the practical difficulties involved, gave them a crucial edge over competitors who insisted on more gradual approaches. Lenin's return from hiding in Finland in October brought urgency to Bolshevik planning that had been lacking during his absence. His letters to the party leadership argued that the moment for action had arrived, and that further delay would allow counter-revolutionary forces to reorganize and crush the revolutionary movement. The example of the Paris Commune, which had hesitated and been destroyed, haunted Lenin's strategic thinking. The formation of the Military Revolutionary Committee by the Petrograd Soviet provided the Bolsheviks with the institutional framework they needed to challenge the provisional government's authority. Ostensibly created to defend the capital against possible German attack, the committee became the instrument through which the Bolsheviks prepared to seize power. Its authority over military units in the Petrograd garrison gave it practical control over the forces that would determine the outcome of any confrontation. As October progressed, the signs of impending crisis multiplied. The provisional government's attempts to reassert its authority only highlighted its weakness, while the Bolsheviks' preparations for action became increasingly open. Workers' militias drilled in factory courtyards. Soldiers debated whether to support the government or the Soviet, and revolutionary newspapers openly discussed the possibility of overthrowing Kerensky's administration. The city that had witnessed the collapse of Tsarism 8 months earlier was preparing for another revolution that would prove even more consequential than the first. The moderate politicians who had hoped to guide Russia toward Western-style democracy were about to be swept aside by forces they had unleashed but could not control. The final act of the revolutionary drama was about to begin, and its outcome would reshape not only Russia, but the entire world. In the working-class districts of Petrograd, in the barracks where soldiers debated their loyalty, in the meeting halls where revolutionaries planned their final assault on the old order, the future was taking shape. The liberal dream of gradual reform was dying, replaced by the radical vision of immediate transformation that Lenin and his followers promised to deliver. Russia stood on the threshold of an experiment in social revolution that would inspire and terrify the world for generations to come. The stage was set for the October Revolution, the event that would finally destroy the last remnants of the old regime and establish the world's first socialist state. The story that had begun with bread riots in February was about to reach its climax in the storming of the Winter Palace and the proclamation of Soviet power. The Russian Revolution was entering its most dramatic and consequential phase, one that would echo through the 20th century and beyond. The night air in Petrograd carried the scent of revolution as October deepened into its final days. In the dimly lit meeting rooms scattered throughout the city's industrial districts, Bolshevik organizers huddled over hand-drawn maps of the capital, plotting the seizure of key strategic points with the methodical precision of generals planning a campaign. These were not the spontaneous uprisings of February, driven by hunger and desperation. This was something far more calculated, a carefully orchestrated attempt to transform revolutionary theory into political reality. Lenin, back from his hiding place in Finland, moved through the shadows of the capital like a man possessed by historical destiny. His intense eyes burned with the fervor of someone who believed he could see the future unfolding before him. In clandestine meetings with his closest associates, he argued with passionate intensity that the moment had arrived when words must give way to action, when the theoretical discussions of decades must be tested in the crucible of revolutionary struggle. The Bolshevik leader's analysis of the situation was brutally realistic. The provisional government, he argued, was hanging by a thread, sustained only by the inertia of institutions that had already lost their moral authority. The army was deserting en masse. The economy was collapsing, and the people had lost faith in their moderate leader's ability to deliver the changes they demanded. In this vacuum of legitimate power, a well-organized minority could seize control and claim to represent the authentic will of the masses. But Lenin faced resistance even within his own party. Many Bolsheviks, scarred by the failures of the July days, worried that premature action would lead to another crushing defeat that might destroy the revolutionary movement entirely. Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, two of Lenin's oldest associates, argued publicly against an immediate uprising, believing that the party should wait for more favorable conditions before attempting to seize power. These internal debates revealed the enormous risks involved in revolutionary action. Success would validate the Bolsheviks' claims to represent Russia's future and establish them as the legitimate government of the world's largest country. Failure would almost certainly result in the execution or exile of the party's leadership and the suppression of the socialist movement for a generation or more. The stakes could not have been higher, and the outcome remained desperately uncertain. Leon Trotsky, who had joined the Bolsheviks only months earlier, but had quickly become one of their most influential leaders, threw his considerable talents behind Lenin's push for immediate action. As chairman of the Military Revolutionary Committee, Trotsky possessed the organizational skills and rhetorical brilliance needed to transform revolutionary enthusiasm into practical military force. His speeches to workers and soldiers combined Marxist theory with emotional appeals that spoke directly to their immediate concerns. The Military Revolutionary Committee became the instrument through which the Bolsheviks prepared to challenge the provisional government's authority. Under the pretext of defending Petrograd against possible counter-revolutionary attacks, the committee began issuing orders to military units throughout the capital. Weapons were distributed to workers' militias. Strategic buildings were occupied by forces loyal to the Soviet, and plans were laid for the seizure of government offices. Kerensky and his colleagues in the provisional government were not blind to these preparations, but they seemed paralyzed by their own contradictions. Having come to power through revolution, they struggled to legitimize the use of force against other revolutionaries. Their appeals to law and constitutional procedure rang hollow in a country where legal authority had collapsed and constitutional government had never existed. They found themselves in the impossible position of trying to govern a revolution while preserving the stability that revolution inherently destroys. The government's attempts to reassert control only highlighted its weakness. Orders to loyal military units often went unanswered, while attempts to arrest Bolshevik leaders were thwarted by workers and soldiers who surrounded potential targets with protective cordons. The very forces that the provisional government relied upon for its survival were increasingly sympathetic to its enemies. Throughout the city, ordinary Petrograders watched these political maneuvers with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. The breadlines that had sparked the February Revolution still stretched through the streets, while the shops that remained open displayed empty shelves or goods priced beyond the reach of working families. The promise of revolutionary transformation seemed increasingly distant as daily life became more difficult and uncertain. In the factories, workers gathered during their breaks to debate the competing claims of different political parties. The moderate socialists who dominated the Soviet urged patience and cooperation with the provisional government, arguing that premature action would invite foreign intervention or domestic counter-revolution. The Bolsheviks countered that only decisive action could break the deadlock that was paralyzing the country and preventing real progress towards social justice. These debates were not abstract political discussions, but urgent conversations about survival and hope. Workers who had supported the February Revolution were growing disillusioned with its limited achievements. The 8-hour working day and other reforms seemed meaningless when factories were closing due to fuel shortages and workers faced unemployment and starvation. The promise of land reform meant nothing to urban workers whose immediate concern was finding enough food to feed their families. The soldiers stationed in Petrograd found themselves at the center of these political storms, courted by different factions, but increasingly skeptical of all political promises. Many were peasants who had been drafted into an army they had never wanted to join, to fight in a war they did not understand, for goals that seemed to have nothing to do with their own interests. Their primary desire was simply to return to their villages, claim their share of redistributed land, and rebuild their lives in peace. The Military Revolutionary Committee skillfully exploited these sentiments, presenting itself as the defender of soldiers' rights against officers who wanted to send them back to the front. Commissars appointed by the committee gradually assumed control over military units throughout the capital, ensuring that orders from the provisional government would be filtered through Soviet representatives who could refuse to implement policies they considered harmful to the revolution. As October 25th dawned, according to the old Russian calendar, the careful preparations of months began to unfold with surprising smoothness. Small groups of armed workers and soldiers, acting on orders from the Military Revolutionary Committee, moved through the gray morning light to occupy key points throughout Petrograd. The main telegraph office, the central post office, the railway stations, and the bridges across the Neva River all fell to revolutionary forces with minimal resistance. The operations were carried out with remarkable efficiency and surprisingly little violence. Government forces, when they existed at all, often simply melted away rather than fighting for a regime they no longer believed in. The symbolic seizure of the Winter Palace, which would later be romanticized in Soviet propaganda as a heroic assault against determined defenders, was actually a rather anticlimactic affair involving more negotiation than combat. Kerensky, recognizing that his position had become untenable, fled the capital in a car borrowed from the American embassy, hoping to rally loyal forces outside the city that might be able to restore his government's authority. But the military units he counted on proved as unreliable as those in Petrograd, and his desperate appeals for support fell on deaf ears. The provisional government that had once seemed to represent Russia's democratic future simply evaporated, leaving behind only empty offices and abandoned files. The ease with which the Bolsheviks seized power surprised even their own leaders, who had prepared for fierce resistance that never materialized. By evening, Lenin was able to address the Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets with the dramatic announcement that the provisional government had been overthrown and that power now rested with the revolutionary organizations representing workers, soldiers, and peasants. But even as the Bolsheviks celebrated their stunning victory, thoughtful observers recognized that seizing power was far easier than exercising it effectively. The problems that had destroyed the provisional government remained unresolved. The continuing war, economic collapse, social disintegration, and the fundamental question of whether any government could impose order on a society that had been in continuous upheaval for nearly a year. Lenin's first decrees as head of the new Soviet government addressed the issues that mattered most to ordinary Russians. The decree on peace called for immediate negotiations to end Russia's participation in the World War, offering hope to millions of soldiers and their families who had suffered through 3 years of devastating conflict. The decree on land legalized the peasant seizures that had been occurring throughout the countryside, promising to redistribute noble estates to those who actually worked the soil. These dramatic pronouncements were greeted with enthusiasm by workers and peasants who saw them as vindication of their revolutionary efforts. But they also raised enormous practical questions about implementation that would dominate Soviet policy for years to come. How could a country withdraw from a world war while surrounded by hostile foreign armies? How could agricultural production be maintained during a massive redistribution of land ownership? How could industrial production continue when workers' committees were challenging managerial authority in every factory? The Bolsheviks' claim to represent the authentic will of the Russian people was immediately challenged by their political opponents, who argued that a small, disciplined party had seized power through conspiracy rather than popular mandate. The other socialist parties that had participated in the revolution denounced the October coup as a betrayal of democratic principles, while liberal politicians who had fled the capital began organizing resistance movements in regions beyond Bolshevik control. More ominously, the military officers and government officials who had served the old regime began gathering in southern Russia, where they would eventually form the nucleus of the White Army that would fight a brutal civil war against the new Soviet state. These men, motivated by a mixture of patriotic duty, personal grievance, and ideological opposition to socialism, would prove far more dangerous enemies than the ineffective politicians of the provisional government. The national minorities of the former Russian Empire saw the Bolshevik victory as an opportunity to assert their independence from Russian control. Finland declared its complete independence, while Ukraine, the Baltic provinces, and the Caucasus began establishing autonomous governments that rejected Moscow's authority. The new Soviet state found itself ruling over a much smaller territory than the empire it had replaced, with its authority contested in vast regions that contained vital resources and populations. International reaction to the Bolshevik Revolution was uniformly hostile among the governments of major powers. The Allied nations, desperately fighting for survival against Germany and Austria-Hungary, were appalled by Russia's withdrawal from the war at such a critical moment. The United States, Britain, and France began planning intervention to restore a government that would honor Russia's wartime commitments and continue fighting on the Eastern Front. Within Russia itself, the revolution that had seemed so complete in Petrograd was far from universal. Moscow witnessed several days of fierce fighting before Bolshevik forces gained control, while many provincial cities remained under the authority of local governments that rejected Soviet rule. The new regime's writ extended little beyond the major industrial centers and the railway lines that connected them. The Constituent Assembly, which had been elected just weeks after the October Revolution, provided a crucial test of the Bolsheviks' democratic legitimacy. The results were devastating for Lenin's party, which won only about a quarter of the seats compared to nearly 40% for the Socialist Revolutionary Party, which represented the peasant majority. Faced with an elected body that would certainly reject their radical program, the Bolsheviks made the fateful decision to dissolve the assembly by force after just one day of meetings. This action marked a decisive break with the democratic aspirations that had motivated the February Revolution and revealed the authoritarian tendencies that would characterize Soviet rule. Lenin justified the dissolution by arguing that the assembly represented bourgeois democracy, which was inferior to the proletarian democracy embodied in the Soviets. But critics saw it as evidence that the Bolsheviks were willing to use force against any institution that challenged their monopoly on power. The peace negotiations with Germany at Brest-Litovsk exposed the new government's military weakness and diplomatic inexperience. Trotsky, who led the Soviet delegation, attempted to use revolutionary rhetoric and appeals to international socialism as substitutes for military strength. His famous declaration of "no war, no peace" was an attempt to end Russian participation in the conflict, without formally accepting the harsh terms demanded by the Central Powers. The German response was swift and devastating. Renewed military operations demonstrated that the disintegrated Russian army could offer no effective resistance to invasion. Within weeks, German forces had advanced deep into Russian territory, threatening Petrograd itself, and forcing the Soviet government to accept terms far worse than those originally offered. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed in March 1918, stripped Russia of vast territories containing a third of its population and agricultural land. The humiliating peace treaty completed the alienation of patriotic Russians, who might otherwise have supported some aspects of the revolution. Military officers, government officials, and ordinary citizens who had been willing to accept radical social changes found it impossible to forgive what they saw as the betrayal of their country to foreign enemies. The stage was set for a civil war that would prove far more destructive than the revolution itself. As 1918 began, the Bolsheviks found themselves ruling over a country in chaos, surrounded by hostile foreign powers and facing armed opposition from their own countrymen. The revolutionary enthusiasm that had brought them to power was giving way to the grim realities of governing a society that was simultaneously experiencing war, revolution, and economic collapse. The easy part of the revolution was over. The real test of their socialist experiment was about to begin. The dreams of international revolution that had sustained Bolshevik hopes began to fade as socialist uprisings in Germany and Hungary were crushed by conservative forces backed by Allied intervention. Russia's revolutionaries found themselves isolated in a hostile world, forced to build socialism in a single country, rather than as part of the global transformation they had expected. Lenin's government faced choices that would determine not only their own survival, but the future character of the world's first socialist state. Would they maintain the democratic elements of Soviet power, or would the pressures of civil war and foreign intervention drive them toward increasingly authoritarian methods? Would they honor their promises to workers and peasants, or would the practical demands of governing force them to compromise their revolutionary ideals? The answers to these questions would emerge through years of struggle, sacrifice, and transformation that would reshape Russian society and influence the course of world history. The October Revolution had ended the old Russia forever, but the new society that would replace it remained to be created through the efforts of ordinary people grappling with extraordinary challenges. As the winter of 1917 gave way to spring, Russians across the vast expanse of their homeland faced an uncertain future. The revolution that had promised bread, peace, and land had delivered political upheaval and continuing hardship. Whether it would ultimately fulfill its promises or collapse under the weight of its own contradictions remained to be seen. The story of the Russian Revolution was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning. The civil war that erupted across Russia in 1918 would prove to be far more devastating than the revolution itself, consuming the country in flames that would burn for 3 terrible years. Picture, if you will, the vast Russian landscape transformed into a battlefield where brother fought brother, where ancient grievances merged with revolutionary fervor, and where the very soul of the nation was contested in blood. The white armies that gathered in the south and east were composed of men who had lost everything they held dear. Former Tsarist officers who had sworn oaths to a dynasty that no longer existed. Government officials whose entire world had been swept away by revolutionary upheaval. Cossacks whose traditional freedoms were threatened by Bolshevik centralization. These were not merely reactionaries seeking to restore the old order, but desperate men fighting for their vision of what Russia should become. Admiral Alexander Kolchak, who proclaimed himself supreme ruler of Russia from his headquarters in Siberia, embodied both the nobility and the tragedy of the white cause. A naval hero who had thrown his sword into the sea rather than surrender it to revolutionary sailors, Kolchak genuinely believed he was fighting to save Russia from chaos and foreign domination. His armies, though often better equipped than their Bolshevik opponents, struggled with the fundamental contradiction of their cause. How could they claim to represent the Russian people while relying on foreign support and fighting against a government that promised land to the peasants? General Anton Denikin, leading the volunteer army in southern Russia, faced similar contradictions. His forces included some of the finest officers in the former Imperial Army, men of unquestionable courage and military skill. Yet their very background alienated them from the peasant masses, whose support was essential for victory. When Denikin's troops retook territories from the Bolsheviks, they often restored confiscated estates to their former owners, undoing the land redistributions that had won peasant support for the revolution. The Red Army that opposed these white forces was initially little more than armed workers and revolutionary sailors, lacking the military experience and organizational structure of their enemies. But under Trotsky's brilliant leadership, this motley collection of volunteers was transformed into a disciplined fighting force that would ultimately prove victorious. Trotsky's use of former Tsarist officers, held in check by political commissars, brought professional military expertise to the revolutionary cause while maintaining political reliability. The train that carried Trotsky across the battlefields of the Civil War became a symbol of the revolution's dynamism and adaptability. Equipped with printing presses, telegraph equipment, and even a small theater troupe, this mobile headquarters could appear wherever the situation was most critical, bringing reinforcements, supplies, and revolutionary inspiration to embattled Red forces. Trotsky himself, dressed in his distinctive leather coat and cap, became a legendary figure whose presence could turn the tide of battles through sheer force of personality. But the Civil War was not merely a conflict between red and white armies. Across the vast expanse of Russia, local warlords carved out their own territories, peasant armies fought for their own vision of freedom, and foreign intervention forces pursued their own national interests. The Japanese occupied much of eastern Siberia, the British landed at Murmansk and Archangel, the French seized Odessa, and the Americans sent troops to Vladivostok. Each of these interventions was limited in scope, but their cumulative effect was to give the Bolsheviks a powerful propaganda weapon. They could claim to be defending Russian sovereignty against foreign invaders. The Green armies that emerged in Ukraine and southern Russia represented perhaps the most authentic expression of peasant desires during this chaotic period. Led by figures like Nestor Makhno, these anarchist forces fought against both red and white armies, seeking to create a society based on peasant communes and worker cooperatives. Their black flags bore the slogan, "Death to all who stand in the way of freedom for working people," and their temporary successes demonstrated the appeal of their message among rural populations. The human cost of this fratricidal conflict was staggering beyond comprehension. Entire regions were depopulated as armies swept back and forth across the landscape. Cities that had thrived under the old regime were reduced to ruins. The railway system, already damaged by 3 years of World War, was further destroyed by sabotage and military action. Typhus and other diseases spread through the disrupted population, killing millions who had survived the fighting. The policy of war communism implemented by the Bolsheviks during this period represented an attempt to mobilize the entire society for revolutionary warfare. Private trade was abolished, grain was requisitioned from peasants to feed the cities and armies, and industrial workers were subject to military discipline. These harsh measures may have been necessary for the regime's survival, but they created enormous suffering and resentment that would haunt the Soviet system for decades to come. The requisitioning of grain from peasant communities sparked countless local uprisings that had to be suppressed by force. Villages that had welcomed the revolution's promise of land redistribution found themselves facing armed detachments that seized their harvests at gunpoint. The irony was bitter. A revolution that had promised to serve the interests of workers and peasants was forced to use violence against both groups to survive. In the cities, the population dwindled as people fled to the countryside in search of food. Petrograd, which had been the cradle of the revolution, saw its population fall from over 2 million to fewer than 700,000. The great factories that had been the backbone of revolutionary support fell silent as raw materials became unavailable and workers abandoned their posts. The very social base of Bolshevik power was eroding even as the party fought to maintain its grip on authority. The Cheka, the revolutionary security police established by the Bolsheviks, became both an instrument of survival and a source of terror that corrupted the revolutionary idealism of 1917. Under the leadership of Felix Dzerzhinsky, this organization carried out mass executions of suspected enemies, established concentration camps for political prisoners, and created a climate of fear that stifled opposition but also undermined the trust between rulers and ruled that any legitimate government requires. The Red Terror that reached its peak in 1918, following an assassination attempt on Lenin, represented the revolution's descent into methods that contradicted its original humanistic goals. Thousands of hostages were executed in retaliation for white atrocities, while entire social classes were declared enemies of the people subject to persecution and death. The revolution that had promised to end oppression was creating new forms of oppression that would outlast the Civil War by decades. Yet even amid this carnage and chaos, the creative energies unleashed by the revolution continued to find expression. Poets like Vladimir Mayakovsky celebrated the destruction of the old world and the birth of the new in verses that captured both the excitement and the terror of revolutionary transformation. Artists like Kazimir Malevich pioneered abstract forms that seemed to embody the revolution's break with traditional culture. Musicians composed symphonies that incorporated factory whistles and machine sounds, attempting to create a distinctively proletarian aesthetic. The Bolsheviks' ultimate victory in the Civil War owed as much to their enemies' weaknesses as to their own strengths. The White Armies, despite their military expertise, never developed a political program that could compete with Bolshevik promises of land, peace, and social justice. Their association with foreign intervention forces undermined their claim to represent Russian patriotism. Most fatally, their refusal to accept peasant land seizures alienated the rural majority whose support was essential for victory in such a vast country. The end of the Civil War in 1921 found Russia transformed beyond recognition. The empire that had once stretched from Poland to the Pacific had been reduced to a core of Russian and Ukrainian territories, with vast regions under foreign control or independent governments. The population had fallen by millions through warfare, disease, and emigration. The economy had collapsed to levels not seen since the Middle Ages. Lenin's introduction of the new economic policy in 1921 represented a tactical retreat from the radical experiments of war communism. Private trade was restored, peasants were allowed to sell their surplus grain, and small-scale capitalism was permitted to revive. This pragmatic compromise with market forces helped restore economic life, but created new tensions within the revolutionary movement between those who saw it as a necessary expedient and those who viewed it as a betrayal of socialist principles. The death of Lenin in 1924 opened a succession struggle that would determine the future character of the Soviet state. Joseph Stalin, who had risen from obscurity to become the party's general secretary, gradually outmaneuvered more charismatic rivals like Trotsky through patient organizational work and shrewd political alliances. His victory would lead the Soviet Union in directions that Lenin himself might not have approved, toward a form of socialism that emphasized national strength over international revolution. The Russian Revolution had achieved something unprecedented in human history: the overthrow of an entire social and economic system by popular forces claiming to represent the working masses. Whether this achievement justified the enormous costs in human life and suffering remains one of the great debates of modern history. What cannot be denied is that the revolution's impact extended far beyond Russia's borders, inspiring communist movements around the world, while also provoking counter-revolutionary responses that shaped the entire 20th century. As you drift toward sleep tonight, let your mind wander through the snow-covered vastness of revolutionary Russia, where ordinary people grappled with extraordinary challenges and where the future of humanity itself seemed to hang in the balance. The revolution that began with women demanding bread in the streets of Petrograd had transformed the world's largest country and established a new model of social organization that would influence global politics for generations to come. The story of the Russian Revolution reminds us that history is not made by distant forces beyond human control, but by the choices and actions of ordinary people facing impossible circumstances. In the end, the revolution's greatest legacy may not be the specific political system it created, but the demonstration that even the most seemingly permanent structures of power can be swept away when enough people decide that change is necessary. The empire of the Tsars had seemed eternal, but it proved as fragile as morning frost when exposed to the warming breath of popular awakening.